From your local's 90s arcade to playing Dreamcast at your best friend's house, whether it be on Xbox Live or the grand final stage of EVO, the exhilaration and satisfaction of a good battle in a fighting game is nearly unrivaled. It's taken the Yu-Gi-Oh! TCG over 20 years, but it's finally happened, and now it's our time as duelists to jump into the arena and show what we're made of. Welcome to the world of Vanquished Soul, or as I often refer to the archetype, Versus. Let me put a full disclosure at the very beginning of this video. I am a colossal fan of this theme. Everything from the adaptable playstyle, the card arts, and even their tag out and revealing cards mechanics. As the initials of Vanquished Soul imply, the theme was inspired by and is based on fighting games. Whether you're an old school, golden age 90s kid like myself, or you're new generation and rock with recent titles from the past few years. If you enjoy fighting games even casually, this archetype isn't just worth checking out, but in my experience is a knockout. So Vanquished Soul is a control-based theme of fire, dark, and earth monsters. Keep those three attributes in mind. Every versus monster in essence has two types of effects: their on-field effect and, for lack of a better term, their summon effect. Let's take frontman and cards you always want to see early on, Ryzen for example. Ryzen's summon effect is a simple strato search for any monster in the archetype except himself. His on-field effect is where the archetype gets very interesting and where it shows its uniqueness. By revealing a fire attribute monster to your opponent, Ryzen can't be destroyed by battle this turn. Or you can reveal a fire and dark monster, then Ryzen will destroy all monsters in the same column as himself. The summon and on-field reveal effects are both hard once per turns. However, the reveal effects of versus monsters are quick effects, which is the main way that this archetype disrupts the opponent. Ryzen, in my opinion, is a great monster to use to get a basic understanding of what you're going to be doing with this deck and generally how it plays. He's a Stratos, so you'll lead with him and then search something else. Then, just like in a fighting game, you'll assess the situation and decide how you want to go from there. Maybe an opponent's deck is highly susceptible to removal, so you want to go on the offensive by attempting to pop one of their monsters. If you think you're going to be going this route, you'll want to summon Ryzen in a column where your opponent already has a monster or below the extra monster zone. If you need to go defensive, like during your opponent's turn, you'll want to use the battle protection and have Ryzen soak up some damage to protect your life points, or just summon him in defense mode. I cannot stress this enough. If you want to have maximum success with versus, you must be adaptable. Don't get it in your head that you're always going to use the same effects and moves every single game. There will be times where you must use and even rely on the niche abilities of your monsters, and knowing how to identify those times comes with practice. The other major mechanic in Vanquished Soul is the tagging out of one monster for another. Again, think fighting games. It's fairly similar to the old Gladiator Beast archetype, but versus monsters tag from the hand and can do so as quick effects during either player's turn. This is super important to know because tagging out is this theme's best way to avoid targeting cards. Book of Moons, Fenrir Banish, Valor, Imperm, etc, etc. Tagging out is critical for dodging cards, and even better, it can and will help you manipulate the attributes in your hand so that you can trigger your reveal effects and ideally trigger as many of them in a single turn as possible. The attribute pool is fully scattered among fire, earth, and dark monsters in versus, and sometimes you'll only have one available at a time, so juggling said monster becomes key. The big guys for this archetype are Burger and Caesar Valius. These are the guys who tag in. It's super simple, as all they need to do is target any versus monster on the field that isn't the same type as them, aka they can't tag into themselves. That monster goes to the hand and then these guys come out. You now have a basic understanding of how versus works. So let's meet the roster. Ryzen, as stated earlier, is basically the main character of this theme. He's a Stratos on summon, can protect himself from battle, and pop monsters in his column. He's our starter and offers removal. The Good Doctor is pure utility. She's a spell and trap searcher, can bounce a low defense monster to the hand, and take 500 attack and defense from one of your opponent's monsters. This is a small debuff that's often forgotten about, even for me, despite the fact that it can be really important. If you can't pull off her bounce effect, or it's not going to be useful in a certain matchup, always try to pull off the debuff effect before tagging her out. Pantera is more utility, and she's one of the two versus monsters that can special summon themselves when you have nothing in the main monster zone. She's also column-based destruction like Ryzen, but for spell and traps. Heavy Burger is absolutely crazy and your main offense. He's got 2500 attack, can tag in easily, and the dude is just heat soul on crack. Reveal a dart to your opponent and you get to draw a card. A lot of times, you're going to be searching for him in your first turn if you don't have access to him already, because that's a pot of greed by the end of your opponent's draw phase. He can also burn for 1500 with his other reveal effect, which just lets you outright win the game in time and turns this deck's offensive pushes into potentially lethal. Again, 1500 burn during your turn, then during your opponent's draw phase, another. That's 3000 damage, which is pretty massive in my opinion, and punishes players who try to stall against you. Caesar Vallius is our heaviest hitter with 3000 attack. His reveal effects aren't always the easiest things to pull off, but they are really potent. One makes him unaffected by your opponent's activated effects for the turn, and the other destroys one card on the field. This does not target, which is awesome because your opponent doesn't always know what you're going after. Caesar is one of those cards that generally wins you the game if he stays on the field for longer than a turn, because his removal generates too much pressure for the opponent to handle. Raka Vanquisher is our link 1 and is critical for extension and recovery. This card has no attack and can't be linked off, but it does give you the ability to special summon a Vanquished Soul monster from your hand each turn, or add one from the graveyard to your hand each turn. This card feels incredibly similar to Salamangreat's Sunlight Wolf in the sense that the longer it stays on the field, the more likely you are to win, a la Caesar Vallius. That's because these cards generate advantage turn after turn after turn with no further investment needed. This guy being able to summon Mad Love or Ryzen during the opponent's turn is generally how you start to pop off and get a ton of disruption. These cards can both search on summon, then potentially deploy their removal effects. After that, tag into bigger monsters like Barger or Caesar Vallius for even more removal or potential utility effects like burning your opponent or drawing cards. In many cases, you'll be triggering all of the effects above, which really starts becoming an avalanche for your opponent to handle. Rock also forces your opponent to attack your highest attack monster on the field, which gives itself and the other versus monsters a small bit of protection in that sense. Last is the Slime, which is like the joke character in every fighting game. This card is obviously terrible. It modifies its stats and that's cute, but unlike the other versus monsters, it can't do damage by itself, offers zero removal, and it can't advance your game state outside of battle. This card is not only so bad that you don't have to play it, you honestly don't even need to read this card. And don't feel bad for not playing it because the Slime is on the artwork of Vanquished Soul Continue, so technically he's still in your deck. The spells are pretty solid, as Dust Devil is basically a high-powered Book of Moon that doesn't target and can easily cover multiple monsters, and Continue is a Warrior Returning Alive Monster Reborn hybrid that serves as recovery. Stake Your Soul is basically an emergency teleport that works by revealing a monster with an attribute, then summoning a versus monster from your deck with the same attribute but a different name. The monster that you reveal does not need to be a versus monster itself. That is very important. The traps, on the other hand, are not super great. Calamity would have been one of the best cards in the theme had it just been a plain Jane Infernity Barrier, but it only works on targeting effects, which, as I mentioned earlier, versus specializes in beating already. So this was like the one thing that we didn't need at all. Trinity is a super duper compulse that bounces a lot of your opponent's cards, but does require a decent amount of setup to maximize its potential. Some builds run one, but it's a very optional card. Right about now, you're probably wondering, as I was, how the heck do I consistently get Dark Earth and Fire monsters into my hand outside of searching them with Ryzen? The simple answer to that is play generic monsters with those specific attributes. This is where things get really fun. Even though we're pretty tied down to those specifically, there are so many high utility and awesome monsters to choose from. You want hand traps? Yes, I understand that we don't have the hand trap god that is Max C like they do in the OCG, but we do have Ash Blossom for fire, DD Crow for dark, and Ghost Spell for earth. Want to go outside the box? Look no further than Dimensional Shifter or Fantastical Dragon Phantasme. Both are dark attribute. How about some board breakers? We got you. You can play kaijus like Dogoran or Kumongus to answer boss monsters, or you can take it up a level and play Kurikara, which is kind of like a super kaiju. Also, keep in mind with these supportive cards, you need to analyze them from every angle. I was afraid to run Dogoran at first, but after siding it a couple of times, I realized that while it has a crazy high attack value, it also comes with a minuscule defense, one that's in fact lower than every versus monster, making it super easy to bounce back to my hand with Mad Love. At that point, I can just kaiju my opponent again, stake my soul on it, or just use it as a fire monster monster in hand for the Vanquish Soul effects. Lastly, we have, in my opinion, one of the MVPs and some niche picks. Kashtira Fenrir is straight up stupid in this deck. It's good going first or second, and Fenrir searching itself gives you an earth monster in hand for your versus monsters. You can also tech in a copy of Kashtira Riseheart to search a fire if that's what you need. This opens up the potential for instant rank 7 plays and the ability to summon a Riseheart if your opponent uses Shang during that turn. Honestly, you just get so many options. There's also some theory about Therion King Regulus, which can be summoned using Burger from the graveyard, and this of course gives us an Omni negation. What makes all these random cards feel so rewarding is that they're not just great cards in a vacuum that can work in a multitude of different situations. Of course, they do help us use the Vanquish Soul monster effects, but they can also serve as bridges for Small World. You can take your board breakers and bridge them into Ryzen for an opening play, or maybe trade in an extra versus monster that you don't need for a hand trap. Vanquish Soul can sometimes be slow to start up, and the opening plays often don't even veer into getting nib territory, but you do so much playing and disrupting during your opponent's turn that often the Vanquish Soul opening moves look deceptively weak. Again, this deck is very similar to Salamangreat. Vanquish Soul has little reliance on the extra deck outside of its dedicated Link monster, but oddly enough can make good use of many powerhouses. This includes loads of rank 4s like Zodiac Borbo, which can lead to 6 material Zeus plays, Evilsworn Exciton Knight, and my personal goo, the Blackluster Soldier Chaos Link, which some decks actually can't out when it gets to 4500 attack. This deck does have some clear downsides, like being normal summon reliant outside of Stake Your Soul, a significant reliance on Ryzen to get an ideal turn 1 setup, and a Link monster that's solid, pun intended, who gets better as the game goes on, but can become a huge liability if it gets negated, because your opponent will hammer this thing as hard as possible since it does have 0 attack. You can play Floodgates like there can only be one since the typing is all different, and even Skill Drain works in Vanquish Soul since their tagging effects can be chained to summon effects like Ryzen and Mad Love to make them still resolve, but these cards are not necessary. Overall, I think Vanquish Soul is super interactive, loads of fun, especially for people who enjoy fighting games or skill-intensive control decks. It can be built many different ways, and the artwork, which I love, reminds me of Blaze Blue and Guilty Gear, while the theme itself gives me some big Street Fighter Third Strike vibes. In my opinion, it's already competitive and should only get better with new support in Age of Overlord. Ironically, while I was waiting for the thumbnail of this video to be made, the new support from Age of Overlord was revealed, so let's go ahead and talk about it. Snow Devil is pretty much in line with the other traps, highly situational but with big potential payoff. It works best, of course, if you have all 3 attributes in hand. At that point, it'll do a bunch of burn damage to your opponent and even nuke all their monsters, but it also kills your rock. I'm not a fan of these types of cards that really work best when you're already completely set up, because that's a situation that's not always going to happen, so this card is a pass for me. Jiaolong, on the other hand, was a much needed fire monster and gives us another tiny bit of disruption, as it can let you switch the battle position of any monster on the field. Most of the time, you're going to be switching one of your opponent's attack position monsters to defense mode. It also has a Rhoda effect, but it does require 2 fire monsters, so it's not exactly the most consistent thing. The more important part of this card is that it makes Ryzen and Stake Your Soul a little better and definitively gives the boot to the slime out of this deck. This card seems like a solid one of, in my opinion. Vanquish Soul players in the TCG have been experimenting with DPE packages, Pankratops in the main deck, both of which I've played and I can personally attest to, and I'm even messing around with Dogmatica. The versatility of Versus is truly one of the best aspects of playing this deck. But enough talking, duelists. Time to get out there and play. Prepare for combat.